What I'm about to tell you is a true story. Every detail comes from court documents, FBI recordings, and public records. You may find this hard to believe. I certainly did when I first discovered it. But I promise you, this actually happened. It's the story of a small-town sheriff who sold law enforcement authority like items on a menu, the FBI agents who caught him on camera, and a decision at the last moment that raises troubling questions about equal justice. Let's dive into, did the sheriff get away with it? You decide. Sheriff Scott sits behind his desk, an auxiliary deputy badge gleaming in his palm. The silver medal catches the fluorescent office light, briefly reflecting off the framed flag behind him. Across from him, a businessman reaches into his jacket. $5,000 cash. The sheriff slides the badge across the desk. Another transaction complete. Another piece of law enforcement authority sold to the highest bidder. But here's what the sheriff doesn't know. This isn't just any businessman. This is an undercover FBI agent. And every word, every dollar, every badge, it's all being recorded, audio and video. The cameras are rolling. The corruption is being captured in real time, and what those recordings will reveal will shock even veteran federal prosecutors. How does a trusted community leader become this? That story begins with a decorated law enforcement veteran who thought he was just trying to serve his community again. But it ends with questions about justice, accountability, and whether corruption has consequences when you hold the right connections. Hi, I'm Steve Rode, and you're listening to True Crime Cases You Haven't Heard, where we uncover real criminal cases most people never heard of, told with some dignity and depth based entirely on public records. Everything you will hear is based on federal court documents, official government sources, media reports, and public records. Individual details are as documented. Today, the story of how a small-town Virginia sheriff created a marketplace where law enforcement authority was literally for sale. FBI agents bought badges with cash. A decorated volunteer law enforcement officer became both a victim and a recruiter. And when it all collapsed, the aftermath revealed something troubling about how accountability actually works in America. By the end of this story, you'll wrestle with a question that goes to the heart of American justice. Is accountability applied equally? Or does it depend on who you know? I'm calling our main subject Sheriff Scott, because I want you to focus on the evidence first, the recordings, the FBI stings, the systemic corruption at the center of this federal case. When I reveal his full name later, you'll understand why this case became about much more than local crime, and why this wasn't just a good sheriff who made an innocent error. Culpeper County, Virginia, population 55,000. The kind of place where your sheriff shops at the same grocery store and answers directly to you at election time. When you elect a sheriff here, you're choosing someone who can deputize others, give citizens real law enforcement authority to make arrests, carry weapons, and exercise the power of the state. Sheriff Scott had been elected sheriff since 2011 and re-elected twice, trusted and respected. But by 2022, Sheriff Scott had discovered something irresistible about his authority. He could sell it. That badge, once earned through sweat and service, had become a trinket with a price tag. James Metcalf stared at a check in his hands he was preparing to hand over. In 60-something years of life, he'd never bought anything like this before. According to court documents, James Metcalf had extensive volunteer law enforcement experience spanning multiple jurisdictions over several decades. Reserve deputy sheriff, reserve police officer, emergency medical technician, and volunteer service, including Pentagon security operations as a Northern Virginia auxiliary officer. After 9/11, he served at the Pentagon perimeter, earning recognition for his service, the kind of background that opens doors. Later, Metcalf would describe his thinking to federal investigators. He told himself this was just helping a good sheriff, supporting law enforcement. But deep down, he knew better.
I knew what I was doing.
Metcalf would later tell federal investigators.
I knew I was paying for the position.
Even good people can fall momentarily into traps they know they shouldn't step into. Having worked in emergency services myself, I understand how powerful that desire to be involved can feel. The pull to be part of something important. August 30th, 2022. $5,000. One check, one badge. The fall from decorated veteran to willing participant was complete. Within weeks, Metcalf became an active recruiter, proving he understood exactly how corruption works.
You don't just get money because you clap your hands.
Metcalf explained in secretly recorded conversations.
Why though? They going to give money? Nah, it don't work like that. It don't work like that.
Metcalf would go on to recruit or attempt to recruit 6 additional people into the scheme. Sheriff Scott had a business. According to federal court documents, he created a price list. $5,000 gets you basic auxiliary deputy badge. $10,000, the enhanced package. $20,000, extended authority. $25,000, premium packages with special benefits. These weren't just badges and credentials. They were symbols of trust, entrusted to a man elected by his neighbors, and sold to men they'd never meet. Every time Sheriff Scott slid a badge across his desk, he wasn't serving justice. He was selling it. Take Rick Rahim. Court documents show he gave Sheriff Scott $25,000 in cash, and in return, a badge and restored gun rights, despite Rahim's felony record for passing bad checks. Sheriff Scott wasn't just selling badges, he was treating law enforcement authority like a commodity with price tags and customer accounts. Court documents reveal the real danger. People could have used these badges to get out of traffic tickets across multiple states, carried weapons based on credentials they bought, and some had criminal records that should have disqualified them. But Sheriff Scott made one fatal miscalculation. Some of his customers were federal agents recording everything. The FBI had been watching for months. 2 undercover agents, UC1 and UC2, were posing as wealthy businessmen. And they were ready to document everything with both audio and video evidence of corruption in action. According to court testimony, Agent Mike strapped multiple recording devices to his body, what he called micro-small equipment, custom-made by the FBI. Homemade, in-house, he would later testify. And the emphasis is on agent safety, because you don't want these devices to be discovered on you during an operation. If Sheriff Scott discovered them, the operation would be blown, and the agent could be in real danger. Agent Mike turned on the recorders before leaving for the sheriff's office, knowing that they'd run all day. Some might fail. It's actually fairly common, he testified. But redundant systems meant they'd capture what mattered. Sheriff Scott is about to sell law enforcement badges to federal investigators whose bodies are wired with recording equipment capturing all the illegal moments. According to court documents, UC1 paid $5,000 in cash and received a badge the same day. UC2 told Sheriff Scott he was a convicted felon someone legally prohibited from possessing firearms.
I don't need to know the details.
Sheriff Scott told him. UC2 paid $10,000 in cash, got a badge anyway. The audio recorders captured every word perfectly. Everyone knew exactly what they were doing, and federal agents, risking their safety with concealed recording devices strapped to their bodies, were capturing it all as evidence that would later be played in a federal courtroom. By January 2023, Sheriff Scott seemed to know he was in trouble. Court records show what happened next. He contacted Individual 1 with 4 firearms and instructions to create false documentation claiming the cash transactions had been gun purchases. Federal investigators documented Sheriff Scott's text message to a co-conspirator. I'm reading directly from the court documents.
New judge hasn't done any but just sign off and weren't on court docket. Wants to talk to Paul about it for now, and for future proceedings. Good thing is that he didn't seem too concerned about sliding one in during the judicial emergency period.
He was literally discussing how to manipulate court schedules to rush through auxiliary deputy swearing-in ceremonies. These weren't the words of someone operating legally. This was someone desperately trying to avoid getting caught, but it was too late. The FBI had documented everything. December 11th, 2024, Federal Courthouse, Charlottesville, Virginia. Jury selection begins. At the defendant's table sat Sheriff Scott in jeans and cowboy boots, his blazer adorned with a gold sheriff's lapel pin, still presenting himself as the lawman he claimed to be. Federal prosecutors presented devastating evidence. The jury didn't just hear about corruption, they saw it happening. Prosecutors played video footage of Sheriff Scott accepting cash and checks, and then handing out badges. They heard multiple audio recordings of Sheriff Scott discussing payments. The FBI's financial analysis showed Sheriff Scott spending beyond his means, diverting claimed campaign contributions into personal accounts. Undercover FBI agents described handing Sheriff Scott envelopes with $5,000 or $10,000 cash immediately after being sworn in as deputies. Sheriff Scott took the stand in his own defense, insisting there was no connection between payments and badges. December 18th, 2024. After just over 2 hours of deliberation, the jury quickly returned. Sheriff Scott sat stoically as the verdict was read, his family behind him. I'm holding a copy of the actual jury verdict form right now. 12 jurors, 12 counts, and next to every single charge, a big check mark. Conspiracy, honest services fraud, bribery. There's a handwritten check mark in the guilty box. Everyone. And it's signed by the jury foreman. Guilty. All counts. March 21st, 2025. A federal judge delivered the sentence. 10 years in federal prison. The judge was direct.
The jury determined you are a criminal. You sold badges to wealthy men who thought they were above the law. Your actions undermine the public trust.
Sheriff Scott said nothing. He left the courthouse a convicted felon facing a decade in prison. The full scope of Sheriff Scott's betrayal became clear when the new sheriff took office in 2025. He discovered that Sheriff Scott had appointed about 50 untrained auxiliary deputies, most living in other states, never setting foot in Culpeper County except to be sworn in and collect their badges. Were there other envelopes of cash, other handshake deals? The new sheriff faced an impossible question. Which badges were bought and which were earned? The new sheriff just immediately shut down the program. But the damage was already done. How many of those 50 badges were still out there, still being flashed at traffic stops, still opening doors that should have stayed closed. The new sheriff faced an impossible question: which credentials were legitimate and which were bought and paid for? James Metcalf faced his own reckoning. On January 10, 2024, Metcalf pleaded guilty to federal bribery charges. On March 21, 2025, he was sentenced to 3 years of probation and ordered to pay $75,000 in fines. Despite his cooperation and decades of volunteer law enforcement service, Metcalf is now a convicted felon, and his law enforcement days are behind him. Participation in corruption had real consequences. With just days remaining before his prison sentence would begin, a single phone call transformed this local corruption case into something worth talking about. The man I've been calling Sheriff Scott throughout this episode has a full name. Sheriff Scott's full name is Scott Howard Jenkins. And that phone call? It was news of a full presidential pardon. Scott Howard Jenkins would never spend a day in prison. Jenkins supporters weren't silent. They argued this was exactly the kind of case that justified a presidential intervention. The president called it a vindictive prosecution by the previous administration, claiming Jenkins and his family had been dragged through hell by a corrupt and weaponized Justice Department. But here's what makes the case so troubling. Only Jenkins received a pardon. The others involved in the exact same scheme, they all still face consequences. Scott Howard Jenkins was recorded selling badges to FBI agents, caught on video taking cash for law enforcement credentials, and a jury needed just over 2 hours to convict him on all counts. Yet, Jenkins received a full presidential pardon, while James Metcalf, the decorated sworn officer with decades of volunteer service, full cooperation with investigators, and acceptance of responsibility, still faced 3 years of probation and $75,000 in fines. Rick Rahim and Fred Gumbinner, and all the other participants, no pardons. They still face their probation requirements and tens of thousands of dollars in fines. Pardons would have restored their clean records and eliminated these penalties. So, why does the man who received the money get a free pass, while the men that gave the money get punished? If this pardon was about correcting an injustice, why was it selective? Why forgive only the sheriff who created the marketplace, while leaving everyone else to face consequences for the same scheme? When justice appears to be applied unequally, does it cease to be justice at all? Visit truecrimeunheard.com, find this episode, and tell me what you think. Because if we can't hold powerful people accountable and equally, what does that say about the rule of law in America? The people of Culpeper County deserved better than a sheriff who turned law enforcement authority into a commodity for sale. They elected someone to protect their community, not profit from their trust. Today, Scott Howard Jenkins walks free, while everyone else involved continues serving their sentences. The over $75,000 in bribes have been legally forgiven, and the badges sold to FBI agents on video have been officially pardoned. But the question this case raises about accountability, selective justice, and who the law truly serves, those remain unanswered. Thanks for listening to True Crime Cases You Haven't Heard. If this story made you think, please leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts so more people can hear these important stories. You can find more episodes at truecrimeunheard.com. The story of Scott Howard Jenkins reminds us that corruption can happen anywhere. But accountability shouldn't depend on who you know.